study on the life of Paul. Because one of the things that I really wanted to do, I wanted to gain insight into what was going on in the letters based on when they were written, where they were written from, who were the people involved, what was going on in Paul's life. I had no perspective in terms of the order of events throughout the early church. It was all a mishmash of Paul going here, Paul going there, showing up here, preaching there, and writing letters here and there. But I just did not have in my mind the sense of when was this letter written? Where was it written from? What situation was Paul in? So we get some sense from Philippians that Paul was in jail. But what's the order of Paul's life again? How does that work? Mm-hmm. I was inspired to dig in and to try to understand Philippians from a whole new set of perspectives. So that's what I'm going to share with you tonight. So first of all, I wanted to get my arms around the life of Paul. What were the major events in the life of Paul? Okay, and they're a fair bit more than I was expecting to keep track of. Some of them are not mentioned really in the book of Acts. They're mentioned in the letters, particularly in the book of Galatians. You can see a reference in 2 Corinthians, but in Galatians, he talks a lot about his life. And in fact, he mentions things about different churches at different times and things about his life along the way in his letters. And without knowing where those letters were written from or at which point, it's hard to gain the insight that would be available if we did have those things in mind. So one of the things I wanted to do was I wanted to get the life of Paul to be able to get a handle on it. One of the things that, so first of all, he was born about 5 AD in Cilicia. He mentions that in the book of Galatians. He was trained under Gamaliel in Jerusalem, all the way up to, and by the way, Gamaliel is actually mentioned in Acts chapter 5. So he began persecuting the church. Remember that? In Acts chapter 7, had Stephen killed. He was giving agreement to Stephen's death. And then in Acts chapter 8, he's going around from place to place persecuting the church. On his way to Damascus, he's converted. That's 32 AD. By the way, we have really good plus or minus about 2 or 3 years. We are very confident about the dates of Paul's life. In particular, when he rolls into Corinth at one place, he says Gallio was the proconsul at Corinth. And guess what? We have, from archaeology, we have a list of all the proconsuls that governed in Corinth, and they only served for 1-year terms. So we actually have very, very good archaeological evidence for the dating of these things. And oh, by the way, if Jerusalem were destroyed, which happened in AD 70 before Paul died, then we would certainly have heard about it in some of his letters. So what we have is his conversion in AD 32. Then it says he escaped from Damascus, went into Arabia, spent a couple of years there, came back to Damascus, and then it says in Galatians that he went up for a first meeting with Peter, but did so privately. Okay, and what he established, well, anyway, you can read Galatians for that. I need to move quickly. Then he had some time of ministry in Syria and Cilicia. It's mentioned in 2 Corinthians 11. It's not really mentioned that much in the book of Acts, maybe just a passing, like part of a verse reference of where he was. But ultimately, we pick it up in the book of Acts most of the time where we see Barnabas coming from Antioch in order to pick up Paul from where he was and bring him to Antioch. Paul engages in a famine relief trip to Jerusalem, and that happens from Antioch, and he returns to Antioch. So that famine relief trip really features significantly in some of the letters, like in 2 Corinthians, for instance. That famine relief is prominent in there. And then there's the first missionary journey. That was largely through Asia. Then there's the Council of Jerusalem. You remember that one? Where he goes up to Jerusalem in order to work out the Jew-Gentile issue with the apostles, the other apostles who are in Jerusalem. Then there's a second missionary journey, again, beginning in Antioch and ending in Antioch. His third missionary journey was largely retracing his steps. And then there was his arrest in Jerusalem, his imprisonment on the coast in Caesarea, and then he was there for about 2 years and then appealed to Rome. And he was taken to Rome, where he was imprisoned in Rome. And it's interesting, the imprisonment part of Paul's life is a full 8 chapters of the 28 chapters of Acts.
Wow.
I never realized just how significant that was. And in fact, right, his imprisonment is basically from 57 to 62. That included a Caesarea imprisonment and a Roman imprisonment. But then he was okay. There are 2 theories. One is that was his final imprisonment and that he was killed from there. And there's another hypothesis that he actually was set free from that, because the evidence internally in the scriptures is that his first arrest in Rome was a house arrest. Well, it says it was a house arrest, and it wasn't as grim and brutal as you'd think of most prison, imprisonments. But as he writes 1st and 2nd Timothy, it appears that he's in a much more dire situation. But in his life here, he writes Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians, and Philemon. Okay, during this arrest during this imprisonment in Rome. So it's about 10 years from about 50 AD, where he is able to start the church in Corinth. Not in Corinth, in Philippi, until he actually writes this letter. And then it was probably another 4, 5, 6 years, and he's executed. But he basically never really. I mean, he was imprisoned in Rome. He might have had some freedom and had some opportunity to move around, but then he was imprisoned again and executed. He starts the Philippi church on the second missionary journey around 50 AD, and he writes the book of Philippians during his imprisonment in Rome about 60 AD. Now, here's the second missionary journey, because it's also, it really helped me to understand the geography. Right, he begins over here in Antioch and moves through Cilicia into Galatia. So we've heard about the book of Galatians. Well, the book of Galatians was written to the churches in Galatia. So Turkey is this whole area in the upper right. Now, does anyone know where Timothy came from? His hometown was Lystra. So on this second missionary journey, Paul's going through Galatia, and he stops through Lystra. This was a main road across what we call Asia Minor, or Turkey. So he goes through Lystra. That's recorded in the beginning of Acts 16. Now he picks up Timothy, and then he moves through Phrygia and on into over to Troas, which is on the coast. Now, what I also did was I realized, man, when I listened to Philippians 16 Acts 16 about Philippi, there's a lot going on there. Yeah. So what I'm not going to cover these in detail. I'm just going to say the 3 major things I've made in bold. The vision of the man from Macedonia was the vision which prohibited, Paul and Silas were prohibited from going where they wanted to go. to minister, and somehow, and then the vision came to them while they were in Troas that they should come on to Macedonia. And one of the things that I didn't realize is that when Paul talks about the Macedonian churches, you remember that in 2 Corinthians, where he's writing the letter to the Corinthians saying, look, you really need to get your contribution together. I want to tell you about the great example of the Macedonian churches. Guess what? He's talking about Philippi. He's talking about Thessalonica predominantly, but also Berea, Apollonia, Amphipolis, Neapolis. We don't hear as much about the churches in those lesser cities. But Philippi and Thessalonica were the two big churches in major cities in Macedonia. So that whole northern part of what we think of as Greece, it actually is a nation now called Macedonia. That's Macedonia. And down at the bottom that we call Greece, where Athens and Corinth and Centuria are. So Athens and Corinth are close, but they're down in the southern part of Greece called Achaia. So when he's writing a letter to the Corinthians and talks about the Macedonian churches, he's talking about Philippi, okay, and the others up there, but he's talking probably about Philippi. So what he does is he actually makes his way across to Philippi, and that's Acts chapter 16. So again, just the three things I thought were notable just to lodge in my mind. I'm a 3-point guy. So Acts 16, the vision of the man from Macedonia, calling him over, and Philippi's in Macedonia, then the conversion of Lydia and the conversion of the Philippian jailer, right? So I'm not gonna go any further on that. I just wanted to familiarize you with all these things. And by the way, it's really cool to take this map and to read through Acts 16, 17, and 18. Because it says exactly this, then they went here and then they went there and they did this, they couldn't go into there, but then they went there. And some of those words are regions and some are cities. So it's helpful to have a good map that's got it all sketched out for you. So let's get into Philippians. One of the things that was really interesting to me was asking myself, what were the circumstances under which this letter was written? Paul started the church in about 50 AD, and he's now in chains. Okay, that's an important part of the circumstances. He's now in chains, and it's about 60 AD. And he's near his death. He's within 6 years of his death. By the way, Paul's ministry really only lasted about 20 years. And he probably died when he was about 57. He worked hard. The Philippians had actually sent aid with Epaphroditus. Do you recognize the name Epaphroditus? Okay, it probably rings a bell. But if you read Philippians, he's talked about in Philippians 2 and in Philippians 4. And what's clear is that Paul talks about sending Epaphroditus back to them, meaning Epaphroditus had come to him from them. And furthermore, in Philippians 4, it talks about all this, these good gifts that Epaphroditus had brought. So listen to this. I'm going to read Philippians chapter 4. Yet it was good of you to share in my troubles. Moreover, as you Philippians know, in the early days of your acquaintance with the gospel, when I set out from Macedonia, not one church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving, except you only. For even when I was in Thessalonica, and by the way, if you remember your Acts 16 to Acts 17 is where he went to Thessalonica. For even when I was in Thessalonica, you sent me aid again and again when I was in need. Not that I'm looking for a gift, but I'm looking for what may be credited to your account. I have received full payment and even more. I am amply supplied now that I've received from Epaphras the gifts you sent. So Paul was in prison under house arrest in Rome. So he was in prison. There was a prison guard there, and he was in chains in his own home, in his rented home. But he was able to entertain visitors. I mean, he actually had a reasonably active ministry there in Rome. But they sent all the way from Philippi. They sent gifts of aid. He was now abundantly supplied now that Epaphras had come from Philippi to Rome. Now, by the way, going back to that map, Philippi's way over there on the other side of Greece. Rome is over way to the west on the other side of Italy. Okay, so Epaphroditus has come a long way with relief aid for Paul. So the Philippians had just sent aid with Epaphroditus. So he's gotten fresh news from them. Epaphroditus has just come from them, and he's been able to hear everything that's going on. And I also thought it was very interesting in chapter 1, verse 30. Well, I'll read 29 and 30. For it has been granted to you on behalf of Christ, not only to believe on him, but also to suffer for him. Since you are going through the same struggle you saw I had, and now hear that I still have. So Paul's in trouble with the Roman authorities. He's in jail. He's in prison. And in terms of the current conditions, the circumstances under which the letter's written, the Philippians also are in trouble with the authorities. They're also being persecuted or imprisoned or hassled or harassed by the authorities. I mean, that's the conclusion I draw from that verse. So these are the circumstances. Then furthermore, in chapter 2, verse 2, he says, I'm going to read verses 1 and 2. If you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any fellowship with the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded. That's another circumstance, that he is aware that there is division, that there is conflict within the church, that there's a need for like-mindedness. And you remember Tom talked about it on Sunday about Euodia and Syntyche, who he called out in the scriptures. He called out and said, please get along. And Syzygus, my loyal yokefellow, please help them get along in the Lord. They were under some pressure by the authorities, and they were struggling with some conflict within. Wow. That there's some relevant applications for us. We've been under tremendous stress with the pandemic, with a lot of difficulties in our nation. And what's ended up happening is that a lot of brothers and sisters are now struggling with one another. And this just makes this Philippians book really relevant. So this is what I did. I said, you know what I want to do? I want to do a quick outline so that we can remember what's where. Okay. And this was my brief outline. Now, everyone who looks at a book will come up with a different description for their outlines. And some of them will try to be really careful about not crossing or about choosing the natural sections instead of the chapter divisions. But there's a certain appeal to mapping things to the chapters. Okay. So that's what I did here. I took a stab. I said, Philippians 1 is Paul expressing his affection for the Philippians, for the Philippian church. The whole first half of that chapter, he's just gushing with gratitude, with appreciation, with the affection of Christ Jesus. He actually uses that term. And I don't think of affection as being a a word that describes Jesus, but there it is. In Philippians chapter 1, he says, I love you with the affection of Christ Jesus. So it's affection and chains. Then he talks about how he is in chains, but it's okay. It's not that bad. Okay? To me, to live as Christ and die as gain. Okay? So and then in Philippians chapter 2, I just call that chapter Christ's example. And in fact, a couple of people mentioned how encouraging that chapter is. Christ's example. Philippians chapter 3, I just entitled it Paul's example. Okay, or my example from Paul's perspective. My example. So you see what he's doing here? He's building up a case for, look, I appreciate you guys so much. Man, I'm in chains. I totally understand you're in a similar situation. Let's look at the example of Christ. Let's look at my example. I'm calling you to follow our example. Follow Christ's example. Follow my example. And so Philippians 4 is filled with exhortations and final greetings. I mean, the outline is one thing. It's nice to have it fit in your head at one time. Okay, I've got the outline. I can remember where things are now. 7 life-changing passages from Philippians, right? Philippians 1. And what's that? Paul's in chains. He's afraid that he might get put to death. But he says, no matter. Doesn't matter. For to me to live as Christ and to die as gain. Philippians 1:25 says, for to me to live as Christ and to die as gain. This is a life-changing principle, right? If we believe this, if we trust it, if we trust Jesus about this will change our lives. This will utterly change our lives. For to me to live as Christ. That's the only thing that matters. For me to live as Christ. And by the way, if I die, it's no sweat. No sweat. In fact, that would be gain. Okay? Then in Philippians 2, remember in the outline, this is Jesus' example. Okay? Philippians 2, your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus. And that passage talks all about incredible humility and putting the needs of others above your own. Christ's attitude was astonishing. Astonishing. Then in Philippians 2, verse 14, do everything without complaining or arguing. Can you imagine that? If your week had not one complaint in it, not one argument, what an incredible week that would be. Philippians 3, verse 7, and I suggest 7 to 11 would be good. Whatever was to my profit, I now consider loss for the sake of Christ. You know, life's pretty good, isn't it? I mean, life's awesome, actually. Life's incredible. And that we have a lot of blessings here in this life, a lot of worldly blessings. But he says, you know what? I could enumerate all those blessings. In fact, he does. He rattles through a ton of things that are to his profit in the first part of chapter 3. And then he says, you know, all these things, whatever was to my profit, I now consider loss for the sake of Christ. Loss, not just irrelevant, not that important. I consider these things loss for the sake of Christ. I found 3 fantastic ones right here packed together in Philippians 4. And we all know these. Right. We've done these before. Okay. Do not be anxious about everything. Oh my gosh. That's a life changer. If we could do that. What is in fact, I try to do it. That verse courses through my veins. But the world, you know, the world gets my blood up. And that verse, I pull it in. I pull it in to wash over me and to settle my adrenaline back down. Right. Anxiety. So it turns out that I was having a bit of anxiety getting this prepared in time for tonight. Okay, so I was a little bit late with the setup and everything, but do not be anxious about anything. This whole passage about, and I just suggest verse 8, whatever's true, whatever's noble, whatever's right, whatever's pure. Think about such things. Think about such things. And the God of peace will be with you, he says. And just the power of eliminating negative things. You know, there's some things that we just don't need to read in the newspaper. There's some things we just don't need to watch on TV. There's some movies we just don't need to see. There's some places we don't need to go. There's some things we don't need to engage in. There's some people we don't need to listen to their, their stuff. Okay, now I'm not talking about not being a good listener, right? We need to at times be good listeners. And then Philippians 4, verse 12, I suggest 10 through 13. Paul says something incredible. I have learned the secret of being content in every situation.